do not be afraid that you will get an opportunity to ask questions. So that'll definitely
Mhm,
be coming. And it looks like
mhm.
we're now streaming live on YouTube.
Okay. All right. So I think we are good to go. Well, welcome everyone to the our monthly webinar hosted by To the Top. This is a college admissions inside scoop with me and Brandon.
Mm,
And to just introduce us, so Brandon is my colleague. He has 13 years of experience as a college admissions officer and director, including as the associate director of admission at Rice University, my alma mater, also his. And he's currently the director of college admissions here at To the Top. There's his contact info there, but we'll be sharing that later as well.
absolutely.
My name's Kieran Lyons. I've worked for To the Top almost 8 years. I think it's 8 years this July, as the college essay coach, the head college essay coach, and currently the director of education programs and I'm the head of the academy programs, which are our academic and professionalization programs, mostly for high school students. And I was a college writing and English instructor, and currently an English and writing tutor. And my email's on there as well. So I'll just put this up for just a second, just to talk about who we are if you're not familiar with To the Top. There's basically three of these sort of A words that are the three pillars of our company. It is advanced planning, which is guidance through high school and in some cases into college to help make sure that students are preparing for admission to an elite school and success in elite colleges throughout the years of high school, and then also helping them maintain their success in college. Uh, After that, or if you don't go through that, you're handed off to admissions. So admissions, we help people get into schools, into private high schools, into summer programs, and of course, college, which is what we're talking about today. Every type of package you could be interested in, from a little bit of help, meaning for an hour with one of our experts, all the way to full service packages with admission guarantees. And finally, we also have Academy, which I run, which is we offer flexible online tutoring and academic, social, and professional classes, as well as standardized test prep, which brings us to the topic of this session, but which is standardized tests and college admissions. What is the relationship between standardized testing and admissions? But before we actually get into it, I just want to give you a brief outline of what to expect today. So we're going to start with, well, you're listening to the introduction right now. We'll talk a little bit about what standardized tests are, just so we're all on the same page. And then Brandon and I will have a conversation where we'll ask each other questions or both answer the same questions related to standardized tests and college admissions. Brandon, with his experience behind the scenes as a college admissions officer, and me as someone with expertise in tutoring and standardized test prep. After that, we'll give you the opportunity, you, the audience, to pretend to be an admissions officer and evaluate different applicants, made up applicants, in a way that's relevant to the topic of today. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. So we'll try to save plenty of time for that. But if not, you can always get in touch with us. So if you do have questions for us, I would say you can put them in the chat, or you can wait till the Q&A, and then we'll have time to address your questions then. We'll talk about it more later, but these should ideally be broad questions that will be useful to other people and in the audience, and not just questions about you or your child's specific situation. So be thinking about what we're talking about, and if any questions come to mind, write them down or note them for yourself, and we'll get to them at the end. So, like I said, topic is standardized tests and college admissions. But so I want to define what a standardized test is just quickly, and which ones we're talking about for the most part. So we're talking about the college aptitude, the academic aptitude standardized tests for the most part, which are tests which have been around for decades, that are
Mhm.
required by many and accepted by most colleges, and certainly almost all selective universities. That's the SAT and the ACT. Uh, We also are a little bit talking about advanced placement or AP exams, which come at the end, or you can actually skip it of an AP class you take in high school through your school, or IB, which is similar, the International Baccalaureate. One thing we're not going to talk about too much, but is also a type of standardized test would be the language exams, which specifically are going to be English aptitude exams like the TOEFL, which international students who didn't receive a certain amount of their schooling in English or in the United States will need to take to demonstrate their ability to just do well in an English language academic atmosphere. Another type of test that has gone away, if you haven't checked in on the state of standardized tests, are the SAT subject tests, which I believe they went away in 2021.
Yep.
So we don't have too many of those sort of standalone academic tests that are on this particular subject outside of AP and IB, the ones that are tied in most cases to a high school
Mhm.
class. I want to look at a few numbers. Brandon, I think this is your chart from our one of our last sessions. Could you just kind of explain what we're looking at here?
Sure, absolutely. So what we're looking at this particular graph that you see here is the amount of students who took the SAT and the SAT over a period from 2019 to 2023. So what you're noticing is that over time, the amount of test takers has actually kind of gone down. So as you can see in 2019, you had close to 2.25 million students who were taking the SAT versus about 1.75 million who were taking the ACT. But then you go down to 2023, you notice that there has been a decrease down to about 1.75 million in the SAT and about between 1.25 and 1.50 in terms of taking the ACT.
Mhm.
Now, we all know what was going on during this particular time period. We were all undergoing the global pandemic. And so the global pandemic definitely impacted the number of students who were taking the SAT and the ACT because, of course, they couldn't physically be able to take it. And the SAT and the ACT both had to pivot to their methods of being able to access taking those tests. But also, what changed is that many colleges and universities, in response to the global pandemic, also lifted their requirements for the SAT and the ACT, and they became test optional. So, because of the fact that the test wasn't required as much, we did see a dip in terms of how many students were actually taking the test. But what we are seeing are some changes that are definitely on the horizon as a result of this year alone, especially given the fact that many institutions have come out of course, the global pandemic. They looked at the data with respect to their evaluation processes, as well as the significance of the SAT and the ACT on their processes. And some institutions are going back, of course, to requiring those tests.
Mhm.
Also, the availability of those tests has also been improved given new methods that we will definitely discuss this evening. But just wanted to show that while we have seen a decrease in the amount of students who have taken the SAT and the ACT, things are definitely going to change after this year's application cycle.
Mhm. And I'll also note something you do see here is that although the SAT is the dominant test, right? More people take the SAT by a significant amount. The ACT is right up there. It's not a case of almost everyone takes the SAT and a few people take the ACT. The
Right.
difference is often regional, but it also might depend on and it's rare for a school to ask for one and not accept the other, but often people in different places take different ones. I would say in the Houston area, most students are studying for the SAT. Uh,
Yes.
and at best, they are also taking the ACT and not just taking the ACT. But that's a topic we can talk about later. Um,
Absolutely, 'cause I definitely know, there are definitely other parts of, especially here in the United States, such as in the Midwest, they actually tend to take the ACT more so than they take the SAT. And I know one question we often get is one, better than the other? Is one, more highly regarded than the other? And the answer is no. They are both equally considered and equally valued in the admission process.
Mhm. Absolutely. And yeah, we can talk about that some more. But this leads to, and I have another graphic, which is something that you showed in a different
Yes.
context before. So in general, and maybe just a broad view of this, Brandon, what is the status of standardized tests in to admissions officers? Like how in 2024, based on what we've seen in 2023, how are they evaluating them and how important are they?
Absolutely. So whatever, just to give you a sense of what this graphic is showing you, this is based off of a survey given to admission officers on what factors do they consider to be the most important in making their admission decisions. And it is ranked by the factor that they feel is the most important down to the one that they feel is the least important. So as you can see, based off of this, the one factor that has the most importance in the admission decision is going to be your high school grades and college preparatory courses. So, what I'm hoping this is illustrating is that we, of course, want to see that students are doing the academic work, that they can handle the academic rigor within that particular college or university. And the number one way that they determine that is going to be based off of how well they're performing within their classrooms. One of the reasons for why this is highly regarded is you have to remember who you are as an academic student is shown through your transcript, and that is who you are over the course of 4 years. It is all the preparation, all the academic rigor, your choices in your courses, and how well you perform are all evaluated and are comprised with respect to why that is one of the highest things that they're looking for. Then, as you can see underneath that is, of course, your total grade. So this is all of your coursework. So we want to see how well are you performing in all of your classes, even the ones outside of your core academic courses, because once again, that gives us a sense of what type of total student are you. Then you see the strength of the curriculum. So that's, of course, are you taking APs if they're offered? Are you taking honors courses if they're offered? All of those different elements of are you really challenging yourself to the best of your academic ability? Then many people are surprised that the next most important characteristic is actually positive character attributes. So that is showing that institutions really do value the letters of recommendation, the way you present yourself in your essays, who are you going to be when you go to that particular college or university is highly valued in the admission process. And then you see essays are valued, a student's actual interest in attending. So that question related to why do you want to go to Rice? Why do you want to go to UT Austin? Why do you want to go to that particular institution is also very valued. And then you have your, of course, your letters of recommendation from your counselors and teachers, the extracurriculars, which give us a sense of who you are within the school community. Then you get to your class rank and then standardized test scores. This is often a surprise to many people who think that
Hmm.
standardized test scores are actually more highly valued. As you can see, amongst those of us in the admission field, it's valued, but it's not as highly valued as those other aspects. So
Hmm.
what I'm hoping this shows and illustrates is that while this is a important component of the admission process, it is not going to be the make it or break it component in the admission process. It's one thing that adds to your candidacy, but it doesn't overwhelmingly add to your candidacy because you have to think about it from our perspective. The SAT and the ACT is who you are for one Saturday out of your life, in comparison to your transcript being who you are as an academic student for all 4 years of your high school career. Then also another reason for why it's not as highly valued is because once again, it only tells us how did you perform during that one particular time. And also many of the other students who you're applying with are also going to have a similar testing profile as you. So what's going to be the things that differentiate you from this particular 1590 versus this other student who has a 1590? It's going to be, did you take the more rigorous curriculum? Are you expressing that strong interest in the institution? Are you someone who's getting really deeply involved in that particular high school environment? And then you see that you get all the way down to the end with subject test scores being the least important because the AP scores and the IB scores are not required elements of the college admission process because also those tests are not universally offered. And then also, as we mentioned previously, the SAT subject scores are also no longer required in the admission process and are not even offered by the College Board anymore. So what we're hoping that this is illustrating to you is that once again, standardized test scores are a element, but they're not the most important element in this process. So you as an applicant have got to demonstrate who you are besides being a strong student and having a strong test score.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you'll notice that a lot of these are grades at the top, but to hear students and parents and maybe even teachers talk about this, it's all about your GPA, your SAT, and your extracurriculars. And you can see that a lot of stuff is above those. But okay, so we're putting this in context, right? The importance of this in context. And we've had webinars and talked about importance of strong curriculum and extracurriculars. If it's not one of the most important aspects of what counselors are or admissions officers are reviewing. Why are schools going back to being test required? Um, if it's really, not that big a deal, why not stick with test optional?
So the reason for why institutions are going back to requiring the standardized testing is is really based off of the philosophy of the person who's the head of the vice president, usually the vice president of enrollment. It can also be something with respect to the institution itself in terms of the research and the data that they've collected for what goes on at that institution, where they have determined that they notice students who tend to score very well tend to perform better in their environments. So they want that information to be considered in their application process. So instead of it being only a few students having that data, they want to make sure that all of the students have that data point for equal consideration in the admission process. So that's the reason for why you're seeing some institutions going back because they just know having that piece of data is going to be a very important element of their process of making sure that students are academically prepared to handle the rigors and the experiences of that particular institution.
Yeah, and I would also add that a lot of these schools found, I think it was Yale was saying this, that often they went test optional to try to help less advantaged students who they felt had less access to test prep, tutoring, solid support for them getting high scores on these exams. And what they found is actually the less advantaged students often didn't send their scores when they would have helped because they didn't have the context and they were too worried. And then so the idea is that by requiring everyone to submit their scores, you're actually going to help some of those students who otherwise would have withheld their scores.
Mhm.
So related to that, what happens when a student, I mean, imagine you're an admissions officer for a test optional school. Uh, what happens when a student doesn't submit their scores? What do you think, how does that affect how they're evaluated?
Mhm. So I was an admission officer at an institution that was test optional for a number of years, so I can definitely tell you it is something that we considered. So I would say this is that when we would see a student who, had a very strong curriculum and very strong grades, meaning that I was seeing all A's and they were taking the APs offered in their school, they were an IB diploma candidate within their school. If I saw that, I wasn't as concerned about that SAT or that ACT. However, if I did see a student who had more B's, maybe a less rigorous curriculum, that's when that SAT and that ACT would be helpful because it would provide that additional piece of information to help validate that they were a strong student in
Mm,
that particular, for that particular area of study or for that particular college or university that they were applying to. What I
mhm,
will say from my discussion with other colleagues in the admission field, what many of them often would do if they did, if and they were representing a test optional institution, if they saw a student did not submit a test score, they would often make the assumption that the student scored well below the middle 50% of the SAT or the ACT score for that school. Not that they were relatively close to that middle 50, that 25 percentile or somewhere within that middle 50%, they would always make the assumption that they're actually significantly below. So that's when it would be a detriment to the student, especially if they happen to be relatively close. But the way we would look at it is it would always be an additional it would be an additional data point, and sometimes it would help to actually boost the argument for this is really a strong student within the
mhm.
context of our applicant pool because we see that evidence that they provided us with that test to show they can really do the academic work along with the evidence that they provide with their transcript and with their grades.
Mhm. Yeah, and we know schools, admissions officers don't like to take big risks with students, right? Like, and more information, more context is always better, which is where the whole application comes in. Um,
Absolutely.
and yeah, like I said, we saw especially these disadvantaged students who were maybe just below average, not submitting their test scores, thinking they would look it'd be held against them, and actually the assumption might be that they are well below average rather than somewhere in the middle. Because of course half people are below average at any given school, and those people got in. So, uh, but yeah, I do want to take this moment because I think this is important to talk about the digital SAT. I talk about it a lot, but it's a really big deal, I think, and it is a big experiment going on. Speaking of risks, uh, so the SAT and the ACT, for in most cases, people can choose which one or both they want to take. I took both when I applied to college, and in fact, I got when you converted it exactly the same score on both. Um, but they've gone back and forth between being very similar and very different. At this point in time, because of the new format of the digital SAT, I would say it is they're pretty different. There was a while about almost 8 years, 7, 8 years when they were very similar, and you could probably take either one or practice for both at the same time. Now they're very different because of the digital SAT. And I want to talk just a little bit about what's different about the format of the digital SAT. The biggest thing, of course, is that it's taken on a computer using College Board's software. The ACT, they're working on an online option or a computerized option, um, but they're not there yet, and it's usually done on paper. Uh, it's online. It is much shorter, and the reason it is much shorter than both the previous version and the ACT, um, while still having more average time per question, is that it's modular, meaning that the first half of the verbal section, the reading and writing section, or the first half of the math section, your scores are automatically, your performance is automatically evaluated, and you are pushed either to a harder or an easier on average section, which allows them to get a more accurate score for you based using fewer questions. So if you're pushed up to a harder question, because for instance, the difference between one person getting one question wrong and someone getting no questions wrong, or one and two, was sort of difficult to score. And now what they have is if they're getting one or two, they're essentially if they're pushed up to the harder section, you're going to miss more questions, but they're harder, so they take that into account. And it allows them essentially to not make you stick around quite as long. The format is very different. It's much less reading up front. There's a calculator on the screen, a graphing calculator that's very powerful in all the math sections. The entire math section. There's no calculator section. Um, and the reading and writing section is changed in general. I like all the changes. It makes the parts of the test that were very frustrating and very maybe unrealistic compared to the types of tasks you'd have to do in college. It takes away a lot of those, but it doesn't actually make it easier. In fact, it seems like people find it harder in some ways. It's difficult to say, and there's only been one administration, but um, that now means that there are different considerations when you're deciding which one to take. Uh, Brandon, you said that there's not a difference in the way they are evaluated. Is there any nuance to that, or is it just really doesn't matter? Yeah, did anything from the admissions side that would help influence someone to decide which one to take?
Sure. In all honesty, from the admission side, there isn't a difference in terms of how it's evaluated. Well, like I said, they're both going to be considered equally. The main difference is actually going to be based off of the student. In
Hmm.
terms of the questions that are asked are different. In
Hmm.
terms of the formatting, as you see for the SAT, they have the evidence-based reading and writing section, and they have the math section. Then
Hmm.
for the ACT, you have a reading and an English section. I want to make the distinction between
Hmm.
the two. The reading is more reading comprehension. The English is more of a writing based format if you
Mhm.
understand the mechanics of English writing. Then you have the math section, and then you also have the science section. The
Mhm.
science section is also a bit of a misnomer in the fact that you're not going to be asked to recall scientific facts. It's about how can you process information offered to you in a scientific format. So can
Mhm.
you read a scientific graph? Can you read a scientific report? And so the main difference is really for the student in terms of which question types may fit you better. But in terms
Mhm.
of the mission side, they're both equally considered and both equally evaluated. But this is actually a good question for you, Karen, given the information you just brought up
Mhm.
in your own experiences. Many times students ask us, should they take the SAT, ACT, or both? What's your usual response?
Well, that has sort of changed because of the digital SAT, because the pendulum has swung and they are now very different from each other. Whereas for a while, they were pretty similar to the extent where you could maybe even prep for one and then just take the other one to see if you did well. Um, First of all, you should take it one. You should spend the time to get that data point, hopefully get a high enough score to send to all the colleges, or at least some of the colleges you're applying to. Will make even your match schools or even your safety schools more secure in accepting you, knowing that little piece of information. Um, the short answer is you should try both. Do some practice tests, see which one you feel more confident in, and which one you score more highly. There are concordance tables so you can see broadly how you scored comparatively, and you can also look at the scores of the schools you hope to get into and see which ones are more achievable. If you feel very comfortable with math and you want to spend half the time doing math, the SAT might be a better choice. That
Chat 现在还不能出来吗？你又不干嘛？
one second.
啊？
Okay, there we go.
Oh, here we go. Muted. Yeah. What was I saying? Oh, but another thing to keep in mind now, right? So to try it out, see which one works better. I don't think it's usually, especially now with them being so different, worth the time to do both. When you see how and unless you really are just cruising and you got plenty of time and energy to study a ton while having great extracurriculars, doing really well in your classes, if everything else on your checklist is sorted and you love studying for standardized tests, maybe do both. Um, One thing to keep in mind that I don't think people talk about very much is the digital SAT is so new that there are a lot fewer resources available for it.
Right.
And because it is also adaptive, you really need to be using something that emulates that structure. You can't just print out the paper tests, take them, and then hope you're going to be well prepared for the digital SAT, which means we use a software that emulates it for our practice tests. I can show it on the screen while I'm talking. Um, this is what it looks like. This is basically what the actual exam looks like.
Hmm.
You wouldn't learn all this stuff like how to use the highlighting function, how to use these different markup functions, and especially how to use the graphing calculator if you on screen if you're doing this on paper. And it just means that every piece of pretty much all of the SAT prep materials for from when it changed in 2016 all the way until it moved to the digital SAT just this year are not going to be very useful for you. Whereas the ACT has been pretty stable over time, and there's a lot more resources, a lot more official practice tests, and stuff like that out there for you to study with. I'm not necessarily recommending the ACT for that reason, but the SAT, yeah, is still lagging behind in that case. However, it is a lot shorter, and you have a lot of time per question, and that might actually just make it less stressful for you to do practice tests, less stressful for you to sit there and work on it. And if you're someone who gets really tired while taking these exams and you kind of run out of mental energy, maybe the SAT is better for you. But you can figure that out by just doing some practice tests. Stop sharing. Well, Brandon, let's get back to you. So you kind of talked about this, but do you have any guidelines for when you should submit your scores to test optional colleges? You talked about how it's
Oh,
evaluated, but
yes.
like on the student side.
Absolutely. So, generally, my recommendation to students is this. When you take the SAT, figure out ultimately what is going to be your super score. So super score, for those who don't know, is a term that refers to you're taking the highest for the SAT, the highest evidence-based reading and writing that you've ever made. Let's say you did it 3 times, whatever your highest one is amongst those 3 times, you're taking that score plus whatever highest math you ever got amongst those 3 times and making that into your highest composite score. That generally is going to be the score that's going to be used to evaluate you. For the ACT, it's usually going to be your highest composite score that you've ever made that they're going to use. Now, you're taking that score and you're looking at what is the middle 50% of the admitted students who submitted a test score, what have been their test scores. Every college or university is going to produce that. You can also find that information through their admission websites, but also on something called the Common Data Set. What you're going to do is you're going to look to see where does your score fall in. If you're in between that middle 50%, usually I recommend for you to submit your score. If you happen to be close to that 25th percentile, meaning that 25% of students who were admitted have below that first score, if you're at least within 50 points of that 25th percentile, usually I will recommend that you do submit your test score.
Mhm.
If you're under that, generally, I would recommend that you do not submit your test score
Mhm.
because many institutions have been very open and frank and have stated if you do submit that score, it is going to be used in the admission process, and more than likely, it's not going to benefit you.
Yeah, they're not going to forget it or pretend they didn't see it if it is a red flag. And I would just add to that, test scores aren't the most important thing. You do need to be realistic, however, especially if you're applying to test required schools. If you are nowhere near on their radar, if your test scores are an outlier and aren't even on, or basically what they're admitting, uh, maybe that school's not a good match for you. And
Mhm.
it is not possible to just keep increasing your score endlessly. Uh, some people will get a 1600 or perfect score, but for the most part, after a few retesting, after a certain amount, you hit a diminishing returns, and your score is gonna just wobble around the same average, and it's not gonna go up. And it's not really usually worth your time to continue uh, pushing and pushing to try to increase your score versus working on other elements of your application and or really just being thoughtful about where you actually have a good chance of getting in. It's not actually gambling. You can't just roll the dice enough times and eventually get a snake eyes, right? If you apply to 40 schools that are way out of your range, you're going to get into 0 of 40. It's not exactly, it's not, that's not the admissions percentage is not just your chances. Um, well, what about, so we talked a little bit about how AP and IB test scores aren't super important. Um, I do just want to mention that high scores, above a certain level, depending on the school, can get you significant college credit.
Right.
And taking those classes is often a very, very good idea because that reflects, they are standardized classes to an extent. So that does reflect a high level of rigor in your curriculum, especially, well, do you have anything to add about AP and IB test scores,
Hmm.
and maybe their relationship to the actual classes?
Absolutely. So here's the thing that I want to make everyone aware of when it comes to AP and IB. There's a way that they are used in the admission process, and then there's a way that they're used in terms of credit. So for the admission process, college and universities generally care more for the course than they do for the test. What I mean by that is that they want to see that the student is taking advantage of AP and IB courses. They're not necessarily requiring them to take the tests for
Mhm.
consideration in the admission process, right? So what we want to see is the evidence that you're taking advantage of those classes, and that'll show up on your transcript. Whether or
Mhm.
not you submit the AP scores or the IB scores for consideration for the admission process, once again, that's not required. Now, with respect to credit, you can receive credit from institutions based off of your performance on AP and IB tests because once again, those are standardized curriculums that are regarded as being college preparatory that generally align with the corresponding course at that particular institution. For most colleges and universities, a score of a 3 4 or 5 on an AP test will get you credit. I will admit for more selective institutions, they're generally looking for a 4 or a 5. Harvard University has actually instituted a policy now where they will only accept a 5 for credit for corresponding courses. For IB, it's a little different. For the IB, it's going to depend on the institution. Some institutions are very specific that they will only accept tests for credit if you are an IB diploma candidate. Some will only accept higher level tests only. Some accept SL and HL, but many of the highly selective institutions will only accept HLs, and they will only accept scores of a 6 or a 7 on those HL tests for the consideration of credit.
Yeah, thank you. I think it might be a good time to move on to give you guys an opportunity to test out some of your knowledge and we can give
Exactly.
some feedback. And then if we have some more to add or if you have questions for us, we can hopefully have about 10, 15 minutes for the Q&A section. So
Absolutely. This is always my favorite section of the webinar, which is us turning it over to you for you to be the admission officer. So in this particular activity, what we're going to do is we're going to give you some profiles of some students, and you're going to consider which ones would you admit, and also offer us your reasons for why you would admit those students in the chat. So can we go to the next one? We'll give
yeah, we'll show you the just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. And then I'll let Brandon can talk about the candidates here, the
Sure.
applicants. So we're talking about University of Wisconsin, which is a selective, not elite university. I think their acceptance rate is around 50%, though of course that will vary based on the major and the program. The average GPA of an admitted applicant is or an accepted applicant is 3.88, which is pretty high, and out of 4.0, so that's not weighted. And then here we show the percentile ranges of the SAT scores of people they admitted. So this is a test optional institution, so only 15% of enrolled freshmen submitted their SAT scores when they applied. But of those 15%, you have this purple range that shows the 25th to the 75th percentile. That means that if you're looking at, say, 650 on the reading and writing section, 1/4 of enrolled students scored below 650 on reading and writing. 50% scored between 650 and 730, and then 1/4 scored higher than 730. And you can see the math is similar on the math section, similar, just a little bit higher. So most students half of students scored somewhere between 690 and 780. And what Brandon was saying, if you're in that purple range, you should submit your test scores because it'll just confirm that you are somewhere in the normal for people they want to admit. Brandon, do you want to talk about these two applicants, or I can do it if you.
Absolutely. So first we have April. So April's intended major is economics. She has a 3.92 GPA. We're making the assumption that it's out of a 4.0 scale. So generally this would be a student who has nearly all A's. She has A's and 5s in AP Econ and AP Statistics. She's a National Economics Challenge finalist, and she chose not to submit her scores. So she exercised the test optional to not submit her scores. Now you have Adam, who's also interested in majoring in economics. He has a 3.94 GPA, A's and 5s in both AP Econ and Stats. Now he did FBLA, which is Future Business Leaders of America. He did their national economics contest and he was a winner. And he submitted the SAT evidence-based reading and writing and got a score of 600 and an SAT math of 750. So,
Yeah.
what we're gonna, and so once again, remember where those scores were in the purple range with respect to looking at these applicants. So, based off of what these students are presenting with this information, which student would you admit? So what we're asking for our wonderful people who are joining us live, put the name of who you would admit into the chat, and also why would you make the argument for them to be admitted? So put either April or Adam, and also your reasoning for why you would admit them. And we'll give you a couple of minutes to see who the committee, so to speak, of amongst all of us, would admit.
Yeah, and I would add, I don't think that there's a wrong answer. I think that it would be, admissions officers are people too, and there'd be
Yes,
more going on. They would have more information than this, right? So there's no
exactly.
wrong answer
Just
here. So we're
just
just curious what
a
you would
bit
say.
snapshot. And that's one thing that, and Kieran, I think you make a very great point here in the fact that it doesn't come down to this, because I think a lot of people think that that's the way that the admission process comes
Yeah.
down. Is like we have two people who look this very similar. One thing is going to be the thing that gets them in over the other.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so right now it's looking like most of the folk are citing one side or the other, but we want to give our attendees another minute to be able to put in their opinions, and then we'll
Mhm.
share with everyone who the committee has decided. Okay.
Okay, it looks like April's making a comeback.
No, for a moment there, it was looking like overwhelmingly everyone was going to side with Adam, and now we're getting a little bit more love for April.
Mhm. Uh, well, yeah, so to summarize the feedback in the chat, especially if you're not watching this live, people are saying Adam's higher GPA might, slightly higher here, might edge out. He's a contest winner, not just a finalist at a national level. Slightly higher GPA, and he did submit his test scores. However, some people are saying his SAT math is not high enough, and or maybe that there's actually some sort of difference in the extracurricular here.
Mm-hmm.
But so we have a wide variety of feedback, and which I
Yes.
appreciate. So Brandon, how might you? There's no right answer, but how might you interpret these two applicants in comparison to each other?
Absolutely. So here is how I would interpret it. For April, what I'm still seeing is a student who is very strong for what it is that they want to study. Because we have, based off of the information here, a student who is above the average of the applicants that we generally have in our pool and who we admit. So her 3.92 is still above the 3.88, which would indicate she is a strong student. We have a student who has a strong additional academic profile with the A's and fives in economics and stats. So that's really, once again, showing someone who can clearly do the work. Now, when it comes to the extracurricular, once again, it's going to be about that institution and how they value and their understanding of that particular extracurricular. So I know for a fact that the National Economics Challenge is a very competitive program, and being a finalist is still a very impressive achievement. Once again, demonstrating that she's really strong. Now, the fact that she doesn't have a SAT reading and writing or math doesn't mean I don't have that information. It means that I don't necessarily have a concern, though, also, because there's nothing that's presenting that's concerning. So for April, I have a question mark, but all I have is things that really demonstrate that there's a lot of strength here.
Mhm.
Now, with Adam, economics. So once again, similar academic area of interest. The 3.94 indicates that he's really a strong student as well. Now, I know we see a zero point 0.2 differential between them. That could be for a variety of different reasons. One of the things that would go into that GPA would be, well, what is the academic rigor, right? Maybe they weigh their grades a little differently, all those different things. But even so, they're both presenting as a strong student. Then we also see the A's and fives in AP Econ and Stats, which also once again indicates that we have a really strong student for what it is that they want to study. Also, if you know FBLA, you know that FBLA is once again a really strong extracurricular for those students who want to go into business, but also those students who want to go into economics. The fact that he's a contest winner, here's the key thing. Did we say what level he was a contest winner? Is this at the national level? Is this at the local level? Is this at the regional level? That would be something that would come into it, but still, it's an indication that he is a strong student. But here's where the difference comes in. we see he got a 600 on the reading and writing. That is below the middle 50%. So now I have a cause for concern because he didn't necessarily do as well on the reading and writing. Are there some issues that could come in that could make him not be the best student for someone who's going to do a relatively reading and writing intensive subject? But the math with the 750 does give some strength with respect to how well he does math. But I have one cause of concern here, where for the other student, I don't have a cause of concern. So that's where the difference comes in, is that once again, we as admission officers try to make the best case for you in the wonderful court that is the Court of Admissions. And if you give something that we can't not see because you submitted it, we can't see it, we're going to consider it, you may have hurt your consideration by giving us something that gives us a cause for concern, given the fact that you're now a weaker applicant amongst our applicant pool. And that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it might be a little bit unfair here, right? Because only 15% of the enrolled freshmen submitted their SAT scores. And they might have been the ones who were most confident in their SAT scores who submitted them. But at the same time, yeah, they're looking for a sure thing. They're also looking for a sure thing, like an easy person to rule out often.
Correct.
It's not just a sure thing of an admit, it's also a sure thing for a reject or a wait list. And yeah, giving them something that's so far outside of the 25th to 75th percentile range could be a huge risk, even if they are very similar otherwise. So let's go, maybe we'll speed up on this one a little bit,
Sure.
but
And one thing I definitely want to say is both of them are admissible students.
let me erase all these
Sure.
guys. So here we have another one. I'll start clearing these annotations, but uh, here we go.
So
Oh,
once again, we're still at the University of Wisconsin, and we have Kevin and Bo. And you see here once again, the
mhm,
3.88 is the average for the GPA, and then you see the middle 50% of the test scores for the ACT.
mhm.
Can you give those middle 50% for the ACT?
Yeah, well, and let's note that more people submitted ACT scores. You mentioned in the Midwest, the ACT is more
Right.
popular. So the composite score, which is calculated from English, math, as well as science, which is not usually listed on its own right, is between a 28 and a 32. It's the 25th and 75th percentile out of 36 points. English, 27 to 34, math, 27 to 32. Also, just to note, this range is actually different than the SAT range. In the
Mm-hmm.
SAT range, you see a notable jump in between math and reading and writing. Here, we actually have a lower math score range. Uh, yeah, so that's what we have. So similar, but a little bit different when we're talking about the ACT here.
So yeah, so similarly for our guests who are with us, as you can see, we have two students who are interested in psychology. One who has a 3.7 GPA, strong curriculum and extracurriculars, a 4.0 GPA, and strong curriculum and great extracurriculars. But one student, Kevin, who has an ACT of a 34, an English of 35, and a math of 33, versus Bo, who has an ACT of 27, an English of 27, and a math of 26. So which student would y'all recommend for admission?
Mhm. We'll just give a few minutes for this because we want to leave a little bit of time for your questions. So we're also happy to answer questions in consultations or if you
So put either Kevin or Bo.
Kevin or Bo, and why?
All right, we have at least one vote for Kevin. Anybody else? So Bo
Bo, higher
because of
GPA.
GPA.
Kevin because higher SAT or ACT in this case.
So it's seeming like most of our guests are saying Kevin. We have a few who have Bo because his GPA is much higher.
Yeah. Well, let's look at what we have here, and then
Okay,
Brandon, if you could give your feedback on how you'd
sure.
evaluate these. So again, we have somewhat similar applicants. We can just take it that they have equivalent curriculum and extracurriculars given the schools they're applying from. Same major of psychology. Kevin has a GPA that is uh, below average. And also, if you look at the pie chart, actually in a kind of 14%, like it's quite a bit below what most people are coming in with, the 3.7. Bo obviously has a 4.0, probably not rare at University of Wisconsin, but is, you know, well, is above average and is definitely in the top there. However, Kevin's ACT scores are um, basically in the top 25 percentile at the University of Wisconsin. The composite is 34, which is very strong. English is 35, which is above the purple range, and math is also a one above the purple range. Whereas Bo, with a higher GPA, is just clinging to the bottom of the purple range, meaning that he would be significantly below average, but around the 25th percentile, meaning 75% of the enrolled freshmen had higher scores than him, and only 25 or so had lower scores than him. So what are you thinking about this, Brandon, when you see these
Sure.
two applicants?
If it were me between these two, Kevin would be the one that would be admitted. The reason being is that even though Kevin has a 3.7 GPA, which is a little key thing is that it is below average, but it's not significantly below average. And also, there's a lot of things that can go into those numbers. Where are his lower grades? Are they things outside of psychology where I'm not going to be as concerned? So that's the other piece of that in terms of interpreting GPA. It isn't solely just based off of the number itself. It's also we look at the grades and the rigor in and of itself. But once again, I'm seeing the evidence that he can be a strong student through his strong composite English and math score, where I have more concern over here on the side of Bo with the ACT composite, the English and the math all being in the lower range. So if it were me, it would be Kevin.
Mm-hmm. And we also need to take into account the major. And psychology is a major that
Yeah,
includes a lot of math in terms of
a lot of
statistics,
English.
analyzing statistical results of, of experiments and studies, but also a lot of writing. And so you'd look for someone who hopefully would have a pretty high aptitude in both. And Bo, looking like maybe he didn't, or at least he didn't, prepare for the exam. So we just have a few minutes left. I want to assure you that we are happy to answer questions if you contact us directly or in a free consultation. But if you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. I'll also go back and see if there are any
Yeah.
relevant questions that came up earlier.
So there is one that I want to read. It's a question was ACT SAT test scores is 4.9% important. So they're going back to the chart that we referenced in terms of those important factors. The question is this from this year's when such tests are test optional? How much percentage was this before COVID when it was test required? This is actually held consistent for
Mhm,
multiple years,
mhm,
even prior to COVID. So testing has always been of a lower importance overall to admission officers, even when it was required.
mhm. And I'll also note that just because it's, 4.9% say it's of considerable importance, you have another 25.4% saying it's moderate importance. So you have about a third people of them saying it's considerable or moderate, and you only have about one third saying it's not important. And this is of course across institutions. It's not just elite schools. But it actually hasn't changed that much from the same study. You can see it going back.
And another question was, will taking the multiple SATs negatively impact your college applications? Generally, it will not. What most schools are going to consider, once again, is going to be your highest overall individual sub score and your highest combined score. Even for those institutions where you have to submit all of your testing, taking it multiple times is not going to negatively impact you. But once again, as Karen mentioned,
Mhm.
usually taking it 3 times, it's going to be a diminished number of returns in terms of how much your scores are going to increase.
Yeah, you have to think about, your application will be reviewed holistically, at least by elite schools, meaning that they're looking at multiple aspects of it. So it never makes sense to just hone in completely on only one thing and to narrow your own approach because your application will not be interpreted narrowly. Your grades will matter, your test scores will matter, even spending the time to cultivate a relationship with teachers and your guidance counselor will matter because those letters, everything matters, and how you package it matters as well. Um, That's something we didn't really get into, but if there is a good reason why your scores are low, if there is an extenuating circumstance, providing information to explain that might be useful to you.
Mhm.
Sometimes you don't want to provide information, like you don't always want to, we're not going to tell you to always submit your test scores, but often you just want to give the admissions officers, admissions offices more to work with, as long as it puts you in a good light or explains um, your circumstances and the context from which you are applying. So we have one more question, probably have time for just this, but you can contact us using the contact info here. Based on the examples given, high importance should be considered from a high GPA score for Kevin. However, the explanation weighted more on the ACT score. Was this contradictory?
No,
Um,
this was not contradictory. The reason
mhm,
why this is not contradictory is, once again, we're giving you just raw GPA data. What you
mhm,
don't have is exactly what we were it's talking about, the strength of the curriculum. We didn't give you the full transcript where you're able to see what
mhm.
courses did they take and how well did they perform. So that's the
Right.
reason why that's not contradictory.
Right. And that those say the GPA could be lower because this person took a lot of art classes or pursued some sort of personal passion, and but aced all of the relevant classes to their major, got fours on all the AP tests. Of course, if if they're just yeah, this is not a fully realistic scenario. Also, I would say outside of maybe a few limited circumstances, uh, it's not a formula where you type in their GPA and you get a certain number of points, and then you type in their AP scores and their SAT scores and you spit out a certain number of points, especially for elite institutions. They aren't, they might come up with a number system, they might, but in general, you're being reviewed holistically, meaning that
Mhm.
you can't do something like a commenter here saying where you're going to give 75% importance to the GPA always. You have to consider it in context. And you also have to consider what schools these students are applying from and the resources available to them. A 3.7 at certain schools with AP classes may be much more impressive than a school where everyone gets a 4.0.
Exactly.
And final question, will no submission of AP scores negatively impact your college applications? I think the
So
answer is probably no. I mean, if they're good, you might as
in
well, but
general, it's not going, yeah, in general, not submitting your AP scores is not going to negatively impact your college applications, because once again, there's a lot of circumstances that go into whether or not you're taking those AP tests, because some are covered by the schools, some the students have to pay out of pocket. So for that reason, it's not an automatic uh decision or way in which AP scores are considered in the process.
Mhm, mhm. Um, well, all right. Last question. Will we talk about positive character attributes in the future webinars? Yes, we will. Because that's something Brandon and I have talked about and with our
Yeah.
leadership team a lot. It's very important, something that we focus on helping students develop through our various services, especially advanced planning and admissions. And we also talked about it in our previous webinar, which
We
you can
did.
see the recording of. So if you want to contact us, the information's on the screen here. If you can't remember any of this, just go to tothetopeducation.com. You can create a free consultation or get contact info there. Uh, until then, I do hope we hear from you. I'd really love to hear from you guys. And I want to thank Brandon for hosting this with me. And I hope we see you all in the next one. This is held monthly, so look forward to us announcing the topic of the